Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today we are going to be tackling something pretty huge, the human brain.
Ooh, yeah, big one.
Yeah, it was a listener request. They wanted a detailed summary of a whole chapter all about the nervous system.
Wow, that's ambitious.
It is ambitious, but
Yeah.
we're going to give it a terrific. And like this chapter points out, the brain is just this incredibly complex organ. We're talking like 100 billion neurons.
Oh, yeah. And get this, those neurons form 100 trillion connections.
100 trillion.
Yeah, 100 trillion. It's mind-blowing. And it's those connections that allow us to do everything we do.
Think, learn, dream.
Exactly. Even things like remember and make decisions. And the chapter doesn't just focus on the human brain. It takes us through the entire evolution of nervous systems, from the simplest forms to the intricate complexity we see in ourselves.
Right, so starting with creatures like Hydra, which have a pretty basic nerve net spread throughout their body.
Right.
And then moving on to sea stars with their radial nerves and nerve rings. It's wild to think about how nervous systems have adapted to the needs of all these different animals.
Oh, for sure. It's a great example of evolution in action. And as animals evolved bilateral symmetry, something really interesting happened.
Okay, I'm listening.
You see, the sensory neurons, they started to cluster at the head end,
Okay,
which lead to the development of, well, a brain.
makes sense.
It's called cephalization, and it allowed animals to respond to their environment in a much more sophisticated way.
So like most of our major sensory organs are located in our head.
Exactly. Eyes, ears, nose, they're all right there giving us a constant stream of information about the world around us.
Okay, so the brain became the command center with the spinal cord acting as the information highway, connecting it to the rest of the body.
Right. That's our central nervous system, or CNS.
Yes, got it.
And then branching out from the CNS, we have the peripheral nervous system, or PNS, which carries information to and from the brain and spinal cord.
So it allows us to sense the world, move our bodies, and regulate all those automatic functions like breathing and digestion.
You got it. It's a two-way street with information flowing back and forth constantly between the brain and the rest of the body.
And then there are those reflexes that operate without the brain even being involved.
Oh, yeah. You mean like when your doctor taps your knee and your leg kicks out?
Exactly. Like, how does that even happen?
Those reflexes are controlled by circuits in the spinal cord. It's a super fast response designed to protect us from harm.
It's like our own personal bodyguard.
Haha, I like that. But speaking of brains, the chapter then dives into the vertebrate brain.
Okay, bring on the brains.
And it gets super interesting when we look at how the different regions have evolved in different animal lineages.
Right, like
Oh, yeah.
they gave the example of ray-finned fishes.
Oh, yeah, those guys.
Yeah, so like their olfactory bulb, the part that processes smell, is huge compared to other parts of their brain.
And their midbrain, which processes visual information, is also quite large. It all makes sense when you consider their aquatic lifestyle. Smell is crucial for finding food and mates, and vision helps them navigate their underwater world.
But then you look at birds and mammals, and the forebrain is much larger, especially the cerebrum.
Exactly. The cerebrum is where all the higher level thinking happens, things like learning, memory, and complex behaviors.
And humans have taken this to a whole other level. Our cerebrum, with its highly folded cerebral cortex, is what allows us to do all the amazing things that make us human.
Oh, absolutely. But it's important to remember that brain size doesn't necessarily equal intelligence.
Right. It's more about how the brain is organized and how it's adapted to the specific needs of the animal.
Exactly. A bird with a small brain might be incredibly adept at navigating its environment or solving problems specific to its survival.
So zooming in on the human brain, we see all these different regions, the brainstem, cerebellum, diencephalon, and of course the cerebrum.
Each one playing a crucial role in keeping us functioning.
It's like a well-oiled machine with all these different parts working together seamlessly.
It really is. And it all arises from a simple tube of neural tissue during embryonic development. The brain folds in on itself as it grows, forming those characteristic wrinkles that give it that walnut appearance.
So cool. And one thing that really stood out to me was the role of cerebrospinal fluid.
Ah, yeah. It's not just cushioning the brain, it's also transporting nutrients and removing waste products.
Like a brain's internal cleaning crew.
Exactly. And the distinction between gray matter, which contains the neuron cell bodies, and white matter, which contains the myelinated axons that transmit signals, highlights the specialized nature of different brain regions.
Okay, that's a lot to process already. It's amazing how much we can learn from just dissecting the basic structure of the brain.
And we're just getting started. Next up, we'll delve into some of those fascinating functions you mentioned earlier, like sleep emotions and how the brain processes information.
We can't wait. It's going to be a wild ride.
Buckle up, everyone. Haha. Yeah. So we were talking about all those different regions of the brain and how they work together.
Yeah, it's mind-blowing. And we were about to get to the part about sleep.
Ah, yes. Sleep, one of life's great mysteries.
Right. Like, why do we even sleep? And what's going on in our brains when we do?
Well, turns out sleep is not just about resting our bodies.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's actually an active state for the brain with the different stages characterized by these distinct brainwave patterns, which we can measure using EEGs.
So it's not just downtime for our brains.
Nope, not at all. There's a lot of evidence suggesting that sleep is super important for things like consolidating memories, processing emotions, and even strengthening our immune system.
Okay, so it's like our brains are working hard even when we're not conscious.
Exactly. And you know what? Studies have shown that people who don't get enough sleep have problems with cognitive function, and they're more likely to get sick.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Hmm.
I definitely don't feel my best when I'm sleep deprived.
And what about dreams?
Ooh, yeah. Dreams, what's the deal with those?
Well, scientists are still debating what exactly dreams are for, but one idea is that they help us process emotions and memories. It's like our brains are replaying and making sense of the day's events while we sleep.
So it's not just random nonsense going on in our heads?
Probably not. Dreams might actually be a way for our brains to sort through all the information and experiences we've had.
And what about all those different stages of sleep? I've heard of REM sleep where we have those vivid dreams.
Right, REM sleep is just one part of the cycle. We actually cycle through different stages throughout the night, each with its own characteristic brainwave patterns and physiological changes.
Wow, so much is happening in our brains while we're sleeping.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder if we'll ever fully understand it all.
It is a fascinating mystery. And sleep is just one example of how the brain regulates our internal states, like our sleep-wake cycles,
Yeah.
which are controlled by this internal biological clock that keeps us on a roughly 24-hour rhythm.
Okay, so how does that work? Is there like an actual clock ticking away in our brains?
Well, not exactly a clock, but it is a pretty cool mechanism. It involves genes and proteins that interact in a cyclical fashion to regulate all sorts of physiological processes.
So even without external cues like sunlight, our bodies still know when it's time to sleep and wake up.
You got it. The chapter mentions the study where they removed the suprachiasmatic nucleus, or SCN, from hamsters.
SCN.
Yeah, the SCN and their sleep-wake cycles went haywire. But when they transplanted a new SCN, the rhythms were restored.
Whoa, that is so cool. So this tiny little brain region is basically the master clock for our bodies.
Exactly. And those rhythms, they don't just affect our sleep, they also influence things like our hormone levels, body temperature, and even our cognitive performance throughout the day.
Wow, so it's all connected. If our internal clocks are messed up, it can throw off our whole system.
It sure can. And speaking of interconnectedness, let's move on to emotions, which involve this complex interplay of brain structures, hormones, and physiological responses.
All right, emotions. They can be so powerful, and sometimes they seem to take over our rational thinking. What's going on in the brain when we feel things like joy or fear or anger?
Well, the chapter focuses on the limbic system, which is this network of brain structures that includes the amygdala, hippocampus, and parts of the thalamus.
Limbic system. Got it.
And this system plays a key role in processing emotions.
Okay, so it's not just one part of the brain that's responsible for all our feelings.
Right. It's more like this emotional hub integrating information from our senses and memories with our physiological responses.
And what about the amygdala? I've heard it's involved in fear, like when we're in danger.
That's right. The amygdala seems to be really important for recognizing and responding to threats. It's kind of like our brain's alarm system triggering the fight or flight response when we perceive danger.
So if the amygdala is damaged, would people not feel fear anymore?
Well, not necessarily, but they might have trouble recognizing fear in others, and they might not respond to threats in the same way. There have been studies where people with damage to their amygdala, they don't show as much fear when they're exposed to scary stimuli.
That's fascinating.
No.
It really shows how specific brain regions are involved in different aspects of our emotional experiences.
And the hippocampus, remember that seahorse-shaped structure we talked about earlier?
Yeah.
Well, that's also part of the limbic system, and it's involved in forming memories, especially those associated with emotional events.
Like how certain smells or sounds can trigger vivid memories, often with strong emotional connections.
Exactly. It's like our emotional memories are etched deeper into our brains.
So cool.
Yeah.
And thanks to advances in brain imaging, imaging, like fMRI scientists can actually see these brain regions in action, literally lighting up as we experience different emotions.
It's amazing. We're getting a glimpse into the inner workings of our emotional worlds.
This is incredible stuff. So it's not just basic emotions like fear or joy. Scientists are also studying more complex emotions, like love, empathy, and even guilt.
Exactly. They're exploring how these emotions arise from the interplay of different brain regions and hormones.
Okay, so we've covered sleep and emotions, which are already super complex, but now we're getting to the part of the brain that really makes us human, the cerebral cortex.
Ah, yes, the cerebral cortex, the outer layer of the cerebrum.
What can you tell us about this amazing part of our brains?
Well, it's basically the command center for all those higher level functions we associate with human intelligence, language reasoning, decision making, and conscious awareness.
Okay, so it's like the CEO of our brains.
I like that analogy. And it's divided into 4 lobes: the frontal, parietal, temporal, and occipital lobes.
Right, and each lobe has its own specialized functions.
Exactly. For example, the occipital lobe, which is at the back of the brain, is primarily responsible for processing visual information. It's like our brain's visual processing center.
And the temporal lobe on the sides of the brain handles things like auditory information, language comprehension, and some aspects of memory.
You got it. And the parietal lobe at the top of the brain integrates sensory information from touch, taste, and spatial awareness.
So it helps us navigate our surroundings and interact with objects.
Exactly. And then we have the frontal lobe at the front of the brain, which is involved in planning, decision-making, and even personality.
The frontal lobe is like the control center for our thoughts and actions.
Exactly. It's where we make decisions, plan for the future, and control our impulses.
It sounds like a very important part of the brain.
It is. And each lobe is further divided into different areas that are specialized for even more specific functions. For instance, the frontal lobe contains the motor cortex, which controls voluntary movements, and the prefrontal cortex, which is involved in planning, decision-making, and working memory.
And the parietal lobe has the somatosensory cortex, which receives sensory input from our skin muscles and joints, giving us a sense of our body in space.
Right. And the temporal lobe houses Wernicke's area, which is involved in language comprehension. And the occipital lobe contains the visual cortex, which processes visual information from our eyes.
Wow. It's amazing how much information our brains are processing all the time.
It really is. And it makes you wonder how it all works together so seamlessly.
I know, right? It's like a symphony of brain activity happening all the time.
And one of the biggest mysteries in neuroscience is how all these different brain regions communicate and interact to produce our thoughts, emotions, and behaviors.
It's like trying to solve the world's most complicated puzzle.
Exactly. But we're making progress all the time. And what about language? It's one of those things that really sets us apart from other animals. How does the brain process language?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's such a complex process, but we do it so effortlessly.
Well, the chapter highlights 2 key areas in the brain that are crucial for language: Broca's area and Wernicke's area.
Okay, tell me more.
So Broca's area is involved in speech production, and Wernicke's area is involved in language comprehension.
So if someone has damage to Broca's area, they might have trouble speaking, but they can still understand language.
That's right. And conversely, someone with damage to Wernicke's area might speak fluently, but what they say might not make any sense because they're having trouble understanding the language.
Wow, that's incredible. So by studying people with these specific brain lesions, we've learned so much about how language works in the brain.
We have. And these language areas are primarily located on the left side of the brain, which brings us to the concept of lateralization.
Lateralization.
Yeah, the idea that the 2 hemispheres of the brain are specialized for different functions.
So like the left side is more logical and analytical, and the right side is more creative and intuitive.
That's a common way to think about it, although it's a bit of an oversimplification. Both hemispheres work together, but the left hemisphere is generally dominant for language and analytical thinking, while the right hemisphere is more involved in things like spatial reasoning, creativity, and recognizing emotions.
So we need both sides of our brains to function properly.
Absolutely. And one of the most amazing things about the brain is that it can actually change and adapt throughout life. It's called neuronal plasticity.
So our brains aren't fixed, they can actually rewire themselves.
Exactly. They're constantly rewiring themselves based on our experiences, learning, and even injuries.
So even as adults, our brains are still capable of forming new connections.
Absolutely. Think of it like a muscle. The more you use your brain, the stronger and more adaptable it becomes. And this plasticity is what allows us to learn new skills, form new memories, and even recover from brain injuries.
That's really encouraging. So we're not stuck with the brain we were born with.
Nope. You have the power to shape and mold your brain throughout your life. And that brings us to one of the most fascinating and complex aspects of the brain, memory.
Memory. How do we form memories? Where are they stored? And why do we forget things? These are questions I've always wondered about.
I know, right? Memory is one of those things we take for granted, but it's actually a very complex process. The chapter explains that memory is not a single thing, but rather a system with multiple brain regions and stages involved.
So it's not like there's one specific spot in the brain where all our memories are kept.
Not exactly. There's short-term memory, which is like a temporary holding area for information we're currently using. And then there's long-term memory, which is more permanent and involves structural changes in the brain.
Okay, so short-term memory is like a sticky note, and long-term memory is like writing something down in a notebook.
Uh-huh. I like that analogy. And the hippocampus, remember that seahorse-shaped structure?
Yeah.
Well, that seems to be really important for forming new long-term memory.
So it's like the bridge between short-term and long-term memory.
Exactly. It helps consolidate new information and transfer it to different areas of the cerebral cortex for storage.
What happens if the hippocampus is damaged?
Well, the chapter talks about this famous case of Henry Molaison, known as patient HM, who had his hippocampus removed to treat severe epilepsy. And as a result, he couldn't form new long-term memories, but he could still access memories from before the surgery.
Wow, that's incredible. It really shows how important the hippocampus is for making new memories.
It does. And the process of transferring memories from short-term to long-term storage is thought to involve something called long-term potentiation, or LTP.
I've heard of that.
Yeah.
It has something to do with strengthening the connections between neurons, right?
That's right. LTP is basically a process of enhancing synaptic transmission, making it easier for neurons to communicate with each other. And this strengthening of connections is thought to be the cellular basis for learning and memory.
So the more we use certain neural pathways, the stronger those connections become, making it easier to recall that information later on.
Exactly. And it's one of the reasons why repetition and practice are so important for learning and memory.
It's like creating a well-worn path in the forest. The more you walk it, the easier it becomes to follow.
I love that analogy. And it makes you realize that we have more control over our brains than we might think. We can actually train our brains to be more efficient at learning and remembering.
That's really empowering. So let's talk about another important aspect of brain function, how the brain regulates our motivation, pleasure, and reward systems.
All right, let's get to the good stuff.
Yeah, I've always wondered how our brains decide what's rewarding and how those rewards influence our behavior.
Well, our brains have this complex reward system that's essential for our survival and well-being. It's what motivates us to seek out things like food, water, social connections, and other things that are essential for our survival and reproduction.
So when we do something pleasurable, like eating a delicious meal or hanging out with friends, our brains release dopamine.
Exactly. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter that's associated with pleasure and reward. And this dopamine release reinforces that behavior, making us more likely to repeat it in the future.
So it's like a positive feedback loop. We do something that feels good, our brains release dopamine, and that makes us want to do it again.
You got it. It's how we learn what's good for us and what to strive for. But what about things that aren't necessarily good for us, like addictive drugs?
Right. How do those hijack our reward system?
Well, addictive drugs like cocaine, heroin, and nicotine, they flood the brain with dopamine, creating this intense feeling of euphoria. But over time, the brain adapts to this artificial surge of dopamine, requiring more and more of the drug to achieve the same effect.
So it's like a vicious cycle. The more you use the drug, the more you need it to feel normal, and the harder it becomes to quit.
Exactly. And that's one of the reasons why addiction is such a complex and challenging issue to address.
It's tragic. Our brain's natural reward system, which is supposed to help us, can be turned against us.
It's true. And it highlights the importance of understanding how these reward pathways work so we can develop more effective treatments for addiction. But now let's switch gears a bit and talk about some of the things that can go wrong with the brain, like neurological disorders.
Okay, neurological disorders. These are the things that can really disrupt brain function, causing a range of symptoms from memory loss to movement disorders.
Right. Unfortunately, the brain is susceptible to a whole range of disorders. Some are genetic, others are caused by environmental factors, and many have this complex interplay of both.
So let's start with Alzheimer's disease. What can you tell us about it?
Well, Alzheimer's is a progressive neurodegenerative disorder that primarily affects memory and cognitive function. It's the most common cause of dementia, accounting for about 2/3 of all cases.
And it's characterized by those amyloid plaques and neurofibrillary tangles in the brain, right?
That's right. Those abnormal protein deposits disrupt communication between neurons and eventually lead to cell death.
And that causes the progressive decline in cognitive abilities, which is so heartbreaking to see.
It really is. And sadly, there's no cure for Alzheimer's disease.
I didn't think so, but are there treatments that can help?
Well, current treatments focus on managing symptoms and slowing the progression of the disease, but there's no way to reverse the damage that's already been done.
It's such a devastating disease, not just for the individuals affected, but also for their families and caregivers.
It really is a heavy burden, and that's why it's a major focus of research efforts worldwide. Scientists are working hard to understand the underlying causes of the disease and develop more effective treatments.
Hopefully one day it'll find a cure.
I hope so too. Now, what about Parkinson's disease? You mentioned it earlier.
Yeah, Parkinson's, I know it's a movement disorder, but what exactly is happening in the brain to cause those tremors and rigidity?
Well, Parkinson's disease is caused by the loss of dopamine-producing neurons in a specific part of the brain called the substantia nigra.
Okay, the substantia nigra.
Got it. And this loss of dopamine disrupts the brain's ability to control movements, which leads to those characteristic symptoms of tremors, rigidity, slowness of movement, and difficulty with balance.
So is there a cure for Parkinson's?
Unfortunately, no, not yet. But there are medications and therapies that can help manage the symptoms and improve quality of life.
Like what?
One common treatment is L-DOPA, which is a precursor to dopamine that can cross the blood-brain barrier and help replenish dopamine levels in the brain.
So it's basically giving the brain the dopamine it needs to function properly.
Exactly. And it's amazing how we're starting to understand the intricacies of the brain and develop treatments that can target specific neurotransmitters and brain regions.
It's really exciting to see the progress that's being made in neuroscience.
It is. And the field is constantly evolving with new discoveries happening all the time. The chapter even mentions the Brain Initiative, which was launched by the U.S. government.
Oh yeah, I've heard of that. It's a pretty ambitious project.
It is. It aims to revolutionize our understanding of the brain by developing new technologies to map brain circuits, measure neuronal activity, and ultimately unlock the secrets as how our brains give rise to our thoughts, emotions, and behaviors.
It's like the next frontier of scientific exploration.
Exactly. And the potential benefits of this research are enormous. Imagine the possibilities if we could fully understand how the brain works. We could develop new treatments for neurological disorders, enhance learning and memory, and maybe even unlock the mysteries of consciousness itself.
That's mind-blowing. It makes you realize just how much we still don't know about the brain.
I know, right? It's humbling, but also incredibly exciting.
So we've covered a lot of ground here, from the basic structure and evolution of the nervous system to the complexities of the human brain and the challenges of neurological disorders. It's been a wild ride.
It has. And it's a reminder that even with all we've learned, we've only just scratched the surface of understanding this incredible organ that makes us who we are.
So much to think about, right? It's really amazing all the intricate processes that are happening in our brains every second of every day.
It is pretty incredible, isn't it? From regulating our basic functions to shaping our thoughts, emotions, and behaviors.
It really makes you appreciate what a marvel of nature the brain really is.
Oh, absolutely. And you know what's even more fascinating?
What's that?
Even though we've come so far in understanding the brain, there's still so much we don't know.
Right. It's like this vast, uncharted territory with endless possibilities for discovery.
That's a great way to put it.
I feel like after this deep dive, I have a newfound awe and wonder at the power and also the fragility of our brains.
Me too. It's humbling to think about all that we still need to learn, but it's also super exciting to imagine what we might discover in the future.
Right. And this knowledge isn't just for scientists and researchers. It has practical implications for all of us.
Oh, absolutely.
So what can we do with all of this? Like if our brains are so adaptable, if learning and memory depend on neuronal plasticity, what steps can we take to promote healthy brain function and maybe even enhance our cognitive abilities?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And while there's no magic bullet, research does suggest that several lifestyle factors can have a big impact on brain health.
Okay, so spill the beans. What can we do?
Well, first of all, regular exercise isn't just good for your body, it's also incredibly beneficial for your brain.
Okay, I'm listening.
Studies have shown that aerobic exercise in particular can increase blood flow to the brain, stimulate the growth of new brain cells, and improve cognitive function.
So all that sweating and huffing and puffing is actually good for our brains too.
You got it. And it's not just about physical fitness, it's about keeping our brains sharp as well.
Makes sense. What else can we do?
Well, along with exercise, a healthy diet is super important for brain health.
Of course. You are what you eat, right?
Exactly. Foods that are rich in antioxidants, Omega-3 fatty acids and vitamins can protect brain cells from damage and help support cognitive function.
So loading up on those fruits, vegetables, fish, and nuts is a good idea.
It's like giving your brain the premium fuel it needs to function at its best.
I like that analogy. What else?
And just as important as what we put into our bodies is how much sleep we get. We've already talked about how crucial sleep is for memory consolidation and cognitive function.
Yeah, skimping on sleep is like doing our brains a huge disservice.
It's true, our brains need that time to recharge and process information.
So make sure to prioritize those Z's. Got it. Anything else?
Yes. In addition to those lifestyle factors, challenging our brains through mentally stimulating activities can also help.
Okay, like what?
Things like learning a new language, playing a musical instrument, or doing puzzles and brain games, all those things can help keep our cognitive skills sharp.
So use it or lose it, right?
Exactly. And last but not least, managing stress is super important for brain health.
Stress is bad for the brain.
Yeah, chronic stress can have some pretty nasty effects on the brain. It can impair memory and increase the risk of cognitive decline.
Oh, wow. I didn't realize it was that serious. So finding healthy ways to cope with stress is crucial.
Absolutely. Whether it's through exercise, meditation, spending time in nature, or connecting with loved ones, finding those outlets for stress can really help protect your brain.
This is all great advice. So basically, we have a lot more control over our brain health than we might think.
That's exactly right. By making conscious choices to support our brains, we can potentially enhance our cognitive abilities, protect against age-related decline, and live richer, more fulfilling lives.
I love that message. Well, this has been an incredible journey through the fascinating world of the brain. And even though we've only scratched the surface, I feel like I've learned so much.
Me too. It's been a real pleasure diving into this topic with you.
It has been fun. And to our listener, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the brain. We hope you found it informative and maybe even inspiring.
And remember, your brain is an amazing organ with incredible potential. Keep learning, keep challenging yourself, and never stop being amazed by the power of your own mind.
Until next time.